Hey guys. I'm doing this presentation this evening for my department, the Department of Comparative Religion and Humanities. We do a little end of semester thing every semester, and they wanted me to do a presentation. This is what I decided to do it on because I thought it would honestly be considerably more entertaining than the other research paper I was working on for my actual religious studies capstone, which was really just a little more generic, kind of American Buddhist monasticism stuff. So I thought this would be more entertaining. This is the um, historiography that I did for my Asian studies capstone, which also happened to involve religion. So that kind of worked out. Um, but yeah, this is not an exact one to one with my paper. This is more kind of, let's just look at some interesting and goofy stuff in the world of Buddhism and Japanese pop culture and Japanese history, rather than like actually looking at the studies that I really looked at. But it does cover some of the works that were covered in those studies. So I thought I'd do a slightly more leisurely, longer version where I can do a little bit of a deeper dive for anyone who's interested, just due to the fact that I only have about 10 minutes or so over the course of the event tonight. So this will be a chance for me to go a little slower and say a little bit more. You can safely ignore the kanji in the title of this one. It's not exactly accurate. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek. It really means something like bad monk or perverse monk, which isn't exactly the theme of this presentation. But, most of the people I'll be presenting this to don't know the difference. So, hey. All right. So, it would help if I'm in the right window, huh? All right. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about Takashi Miura's research on Kibyoshi, which is a piece entitled The Buddha in Yoshiwara. Then we're going to move on to some discussion of kabuki via an article done by Kevin Bond, which talks about sort of the divine celebrity of some of the actors. Both of those are from the Edo period. Then we're going to look at another piece. Elizabeth here looked at film and manga, but only a couple examples of each. Not the strongest piece, but it was something I sort of had to work with. And so I'll look at those pieces very briefly, and then we'll look at Aum Shinrikyo, the famed cult / new religion that went rogue and did the sarin gas attacks in the Tokyo subway in 1995. And we'll look at sort of how that affected things. This is the work of Julienned Kannon, and he also looked at Ryohoji Temple and sort of how that did some, I guess we could say, popifying of Buddhism or Buddhist icons. So let's take a look. To begin with, the Buddha in Yoshiwara. This was from Takashi Miura, and was an interesting look at a variety of different kibyoshi stories. What are kibyoshi? There are essentially yellow covers is what that means. They were essentially little books with yellow covers that were passed around in the Edo period. Often thought of as a sort of proto-manga, although he doesn't seem to like that, primarily because of the lack of continuity between them. There's a great span of time between the kibyoshi and when modern manga actually started, which is kind of in the post-war period. And Osamu Tezuka and his stuff really getting the ball rolling on that with a lot of Western influence, and so he doesn't really like the comparison between kibyoshi and manga. Although really there is a lot of comparison between the two, and just because they're not contiguous, I don't think necessarily means that that's invalid. Certainly they both come from a culture that valued this stuff, thought about it in a certain way, and had this kind of pictorial literature. Obviously, manga is a little bit different, but we'll get to that. Anyway, so as you can see here, these are not great images, but ripped straight from the article. The top one, you can actually see the Buddha and yakushi and jizo. I think jizo is the one on the left-hand side, and I'm not sure which is yakushi and which is shakyamuni of the other two, but they're clearly in some sort of pleasure house with courtesans and whatever. And this was a super common theme of these kibyoshi, was putting any kind of divine figure, really, Buddhist, Shinto, anything from sort of traditional Japanese culture could make it in there, but they definitely had a tendency to skew on the side of denigrating Buddhist figures more so than they did do excessively lewd or crude stuff with more traditional like creation myth figures and such. Either way, a lot of these people ended up in Edo, which makes this very much kind of an urban medium, directed at sort of like, townspeople and lower level samurai, a fairly modern crowd, for the time, and often in these sort of fun circumstances with a lot of pleasure quarters and explorations of Edo, and also a lot of money trouble. A lot of times these figures ended up in sort of bad financial straits. And not just, real supposed divine or flesh and blood figures, but even like the bottom of the two pictures here, the Daibutsu in Nara traveled to Edo and was touring around, and I believe in this story ended up having a great feast somewhere. I think this was actually, he was called up by some other divine figure to have a great feast, from the cosmos somewhere, and then basically had to take a massive cosmic dump on the Milky Way, which, as you can see from the depiction, did not do any favors for Tokyo, Edo at the time. So, other common figures in these works were the Shichifuku Sankei, the seven lucky gods, very common subjects of kibyoshi, possibly the most common subjects. And you can see here depictions of them. I took these photographs when I was living in Japan. I studied there for a year, did my study abroad there, and it was brutal, if I'm being honest. It was a brutal program, but it was also amazing. And I got so many good pictures. I think I took, 8,000, something like that. Boatload of pictures while I was there, and I really love these. These are outside of, I actually can't remember which station, but it was outside of a station in Osaka where I stayed with a friend of mine from Texas. Shout out to my buddy Dustin. Yeah, and we had an awesome time, and I really loved these. These were one of the highlights of that stay. They were right next to our hostel, which was not far from the station. So, not actually going to discuss any stories that they were in, however. Just a couple of my favorites from the selection that Miura offered. And this is one of my personal favorites, given my predilection for tako, for octopuses. Not to eat them. I'm vegan, so I don't actually eat any animals generally, although that was an unfortunate suspension I had to make to that rule when I was in Japan, due to the difficulties it is of even being vegetarian there. I made it 6 months as a vegetarian. I don't know, a couple months is fairly strict, another few months is less strict, and then at some point it all kind of went out the window because there just was no way to hack it with the program that I was on. But all that to say, this is an actual figure which comes from Kyoto and Meguro, and was featured in this kibyoshi story, Mazumise Hachinin Ichiza, where a man, the main character, prays to tako yakushi, which I love the name. It's just octopus yakushi, which I think is fantastic in and of itself. But prays for women to love him, and ends up with a woman, and they start like a shop or something together. I forget the details exactly, and end up happily ever after. But this is actually based on real stuff, because you can see here that anyone who visits tako yakushi and vows not to eat octopus will perhaps get their request granted, which I think is amazing. And so these are just a couple images from those temples where this figure is venerated. I particularly like the, I'm guessing that's probably polished wood carving there, which you are, according to the sign, supposed to touch. There's many such statues throughout Japan, which is they're a lot of fun. Not so much now during the the COVID-19 pandemic, but perhaps for later. But far and away the best story of the ones that Miura told, and my favorite of the bunch, was this kibyōshi entitled Daihi no Senroku Hon. I think there might have been several stories in this one, but this was the main one, which is Thousand-Armed Kannon, Guanyin, or Avalokiteshvara, a Buddhist deity. And basically in typical fashion, ends up in Edo, but is running out of money for whatever reason, because again, they always seem to get into financial trouble, and so chopped off their arms, because of course this is Thousand-Armed Kannon we're talking about, so chopped off those 1,000 arms, gave them to merchants who leased them out to sort of various just random folks who happened to need an extra arm for one reason or another, with a few prohibitions about what they were allowed to do with them. The one that sticks out was no hand jobs, which was a rather excellent contribution there, and eventually does get the arms back in sort of varying states of cosmic disrepair. But the stories themselves are kind of funny. My favorite one, the lower left there, you can see there was a calligrapher who wanted the arm because he lost his arm and wanted to get back to his calligraphy. So he got the arm only to find out that he couldn't write in his usual Chinese characters because the arm could only write in Sanskrit. So anyway, so that's kibyōshi, which are pretty entertaining in and of themselves. But around the same time period, we also have kabuki. Kabuki theater was big in Edo period Japan, particularly in Edo. Again, a kind of modern urban art form at the time. And so Kevin Bond discussed some elements that made this kind of very interesting in the religious context. Certainly, the medieval period in Japan was no stranger to religious depictions on stage. That had already been a thing in Noh theater and what have you. But in kabuki in particular, which really was kind of a little less serious by comparison, a little less stoic and staid, but particularly this guy, so Ichikawa Danjuro the First, essentially the progenitor of this whole thing. It's a line of people that would take his name after the fact, but he was the first, and he founded his house, which would go on for some time, up until I believe the present day. I believe there are still people who take and use this name in kabuki. But anyway, this guy, super, super famous, widely known as like the best of the best in Edo period kabuki, and he pioneered this hyper-masculine Aragoto style, this wild warrior style, which was said to be very like intimidating and very powerful, such to the point that he was believed to sort of have been divinely inspired, that these acting abilities of his were gifts bestowed by the gods. He would found, as far as I'm aware, the first kabuki house, this sort of union house, kind of. I mean, his own group, and would become associated with a temple in Narita, which was, nearby. And I believe they just called it Naritaya, so he took on this temple's name, and would sire this line of actors. And famously, the thing they sort of became really, really, really known for was their emulation of this guy right here, Narita Fudo. So, and you've probably seen pictures of kabuki where you may recognize this kind of like cross-eyed glare. And so you can see on the picture on the right here, the drawn picture, what that stance kind of was meant to look like, and usually involved a sword and like this rope noose thing. sort of his accoutrement. And so they got so good at doing this on stage and really just capturing people's imaginations that ultimately they were so popular, and this was all so powerful to people that they were even asked to use this fudomie stance that they would take on stage to perform exorcisms. So this is just sort of a really fascinating sort of reverse of the usual, form where they were portraying deity, they were portraying Buddhist religious concepts, and that was helping to, spread things throughout Edo. But at the same time, they kind of were taking power for themselves in a way, really setting up their own kind of religious function within the wider religious context, which I thought was really fascinating for something that is a pure work of art. So very briefly, we're just going to look at a couple of instances of Zen Buddhism in film and manga. I kind of had to make a major jump here, so we're going straight from Edo period material to way, way, way later. So just ignore the hundreds of years that we're skipping here. But we have a few things to look at. So we have Bouzu Days, which is a manga. And then Fancy Dance, which is a movie based on a manga, and then Abraxas no Matsuri, the Festival of Abraxas, which is based on a novel, but is also a film. Generally, what makes these sort of interesting and a little different is that they have kind of this nice, positive kind of look on Zen Buddhism generally, and they kind of, my course that I did this whole study for was Asia in the City. So basically what I'm looking at here is kind of how this stuff ties a bit into urban culture and to emerging urban depictions and art around religion, and specifically Buddhism, of course. But so these also do kind of contrast some of that rural religiosity with urban secularity. That's an element in a number of these works that I'm discussing, but particularly I think in Fancy Dance, you definitely see a lot of that, with the protagonist sort of being drawn to this monastic life, and his friends back in the city, and his girlfriend kind of not understanding, but getting a little more support from his family and stuff like that. But anyway, these show sort of a little bit more of a gentler side, and particularly Abraxas no Matsuri, Aburakusasu no Matsuri, more properly, is particularly interesting because it comes from a more Western perspective. You can see this guy's playing a guitar there, and rock music is kind of a major theme. Sort of one of the penultimate moments is when they put on a rock concert. And this is actually about a monk who sort of suffers from some mental instability issues like anxiety and really struggles to perform his duties. And sort of, balancing his family life with his monastic life and such. So very interesting. And he comes to Zen through, I guess, different from what you would expect the normal Japanese route to be, through David Bowie's flirtation with meditation and such like that. So it's quite an interesting deviation from the normal narrative. Okay, but really what I wanted to talk about more, because what is much more close to my heart is manga, and I'm not as big an anime person. Most of my interest in kind of this sort of media in general anyway is really for language acquisition, because I have been studying Japanese for a number of years. But I guess that's really led me to manga, because it's just such a great vehicle for language acquisition and practice, and that's been really great for me. So I've sort of developed a real soft spot for it. But I also feel like you can't talk about how things have gone with religion and manga unless you talk about On Shinrikyo. And certainly there are many scholars who feel similarly, which is why I took Julienned Kannon work here, which is entitled Manga After Om. Actually, I think that may be the subtitle, but regardless, I'll have sources at the end of this. But yeah, anyway, so let's take a look at this. Many of you may already know this, but this is Shoko Asahara, who was the leader of this group, and they were not a actually specifically Buddhist group, even though they did sort of borrow heavily from a lot of kind of esoteric Buddhist ideas, but they also borrowed stuff from a lot of religious ideas, kind of across the board. Kind of an interesting group as far as the ideas went. And they were a little controversial. I mean, as many Japanese new religions tended to be a little bit mistrusted by the wider public, but especially after this one, after 95 and the attack, they got, a whole lot of bad press, as you may imagine. And that really made people mistrustful of these kind of new religious movements. But regardless, people sort of, at the time, were a little unsure about this guy because he seemed a little bit weird, and he was himself a very avid reader of manga. And so were many of the people that got involved in Aum. Over time, they would actually come to use manga and anime to produce their own kind of recruitment materials. And so there was definitely this I guess, kinship between them and manga and sort of, that kind of media, which led a lot of people to suggest that it was an overconsumption of this material that led to the problems, that this is what sort of got people into this group because they lost the ability to distinguish fantasy from reality. So, all that said, after 1995, these guys really darkened the way religious depictions happened in popular media for quite some time. It took, a good while for that to sort of fade a little bit from the public consciousness, from the Japanese zeitgeist. So eventually it did, but it took a while, and you saw a lot of sort of very dark, very blatant depictions of cult behavior, very much more villainous, very not particularly nuanced. And later, you would sort of get a lot more nuance when it came to those depictions, as people kind of, to some degree got away from this event, I think. And that eventually, over time, would lead to sort of a desire to reappropriate religion on some level and to kind of to take it back into the fold. And a really good example of this, one that I fell in love with while I was in Japan, I've certainly not had a chance to read the entire run of the manga by any stretch, because, well, I've been super busy with school since I got home, but hoping to rectify that. Either way, this was one of the favorite things that I found in my many, many trips through bookstores and manga shops while I was in Japan. This is a manga which has since been made into an anime, which is also currently being made into a live-action television show by Hikaru Nakamura, and she uses Jesus and Buddha to sort of bring this warmer, gentler, friendlier side of religion kind of back to manga again. And as you can see from these illustrations, like the covers we have here, which are just great, this sort of adorable relationship that these two figures have with each other, this kind of weird divine friendship. The premise of the show being that the Jesus and the Buddha are basically decide to incarnate themselves into modern Japan as flatmates and just kind of experience the exotic Japanese culture and what it has to offer to try and understand the modern Japanese mind. So it's both a window into kind of modern urban Japanese life through this kind of, comic mirror, but also is a mirror into, perceptions of religion and stuff as well. And I really love this first page of the first volume, which is just a great sight gag for anyone who studied Buddhism or, to any degree and spent time in Asia. These are the depictions, the first panel there of the Buddha lying there. Those are the depictions you see of him after his death or during. And animals commonly flock to him. He's usually surrounded by his followers, and animals, coming through the forest to sort of mourn with everyone. But in this case, he's lying in his apartment with the window open, and all these birds and everybody are coming in to, and like the stray cat and squirrel and whatever, coming in to mourn him, and he's like, oh, no, I'm fine, stop, with the nice pun, hotoke, like, leave me alone, get out of here. And then Jesus coming back from shopping or whatever, and hotoke natake ni, hotoke meaning Buddha. So that's a lot of the style of humor in that, but it's good stuff. Highly recommend it to any of you who can read Japanese, although it actually did, against all the odds, get an official translation, which is, I'm not sure how far they are in now, or if any has actually been released, but I think they've started releasing these in English. So now we get to, well, it's not just warm, it's gotten a little past warm. We're getting into, maybe you've gotten a little too friendly with your Buddhist iconography. And so we're going to take a look at Ryohoji Temple and how they kind of popified Buddhism and these divine icons and sort of sexualized them, and sort of a simultaneous cultural, artistic thing that happens kind of in and around that, which you'll see some examples of as we go along. So, Ryohoji Temple is a small temple in the Tokyo suburb of Hachioji, and the head priest, of course, one of the interesting things that this article points out, this article by Thomas, is that his assertion is that the kind of bemoaning of the death of Buddhism in Japan, sort of, the lack of practice and people falling away, that it's kind of a bunk narrative, that it's not really true, or that it's only true to a point, I guess. It's an interesting assertion. I don't know that I entirely agree with him, but I can see his point, and it's an interesting look at sort of the ways that Buddhism has lived and moved over time throughout history. And in particular, in this circumstance, kind of bemoaning its own demise is a way of actually garnering support for itself. But also, certainly, these things have diminished. Attendance at temples has declined. Church membership or temple memberships have declined. And so they all are trying to kind of find ways to, like, okay, let's bring some new people into the fold, and how can we reach younger people especially? Buddhism around the world is one of the religions with the highest median age of its practitioners, at the median age of 36, which is significantly higher than, say, Islam, which is a much, much younger crowd. So he, I think, originally got this idea from the grandson of one of his parishioners, and who was, I believe, a designer himself, and eventually hired this person here, Toromi, I believe that's the correct name, who was herself a multi-talented designer, and like illustrator, cosplayer, the whole nine yards, very multi-talented lady. And so they hired her and worked with with these designs that she came up with to sort of, cutify their resident enshrined deities. In this case, the girl there with the buns and the sword is Benzaiten, who we saw earlier in the presentation in a very different form. And some others. I don't actually know the specifics. I forget some of the specifics of who's on display, because I'm not actually that familiar with the Mahayana, stuff. I'm more of a Theravadan Buddhist guy. So as soon as we start getting into depictions of some of these deities, unless I'm immediately familiar with them, I don't know who the hell they are. So, but regardless, it took off. Suffice it to say, it took off. It became quite popular. The grandchild of the parishioner who had originally sort of suggested this idea started a design company, I believe, basically solely to do this stuff. And so I think what is it, Hachifuku, I think is the name. And a whole bunch of stuff has happened subsequently. So they made a couple of original songs with music videos, which were these just bizarre and highly entertaining things, very much leaning into it. Like they knew what they were doing and they leaned into it as far as they could, and featured some like, you know, even some dancing from Toromi and this actually adult film star that they got for the second one, who danced alongside her as you can see in the center top image there, on the right hand side. That would be the other deity that this other woman represented. So very, very entertaining stuff, and not what you would expect from, you know, the typical Buddhist temple environment by any stretch. There's an ad for the game over there on the left-hand side, and you can see in the center a screenshot of that game, which unfortunately you can no longer play because it was a big ripoff of one of Namco's rhythm game series. It was surprisingly good, all things considered. Like it's pretty legit, but they made him take that down, so that is no longer available, although I believe the second game is still available in Japan, and you can see some images from that here. I have actually not personally played it myself because I am unfortunately with my device tied to a US Google Play account and can't really get to it. I am going to hopefully at some point very soon actually reappropriate one of my old devices and hopefully wipe it and start clean and actually get on either, I think this is iOS and Android, so might get my old iPod Touch and see if I can't get this working. We'll see. But yeah, as you can see, the sexualization of the character is only increased as time went on, and very specifically the ad on the left say hotoke and moeke. So this is like, you know, moe culture. Anybody who's familiar with any of this stuff will know moe as being sort of this like warm, fuzzy feeling you get from looking at a like a manga or anime character. That doesn't even necessarily have to be that. It's usually associated with manga and anime, but also like cosplay and other stuff, but usually kind of in those like nerd contexts, I guess you would say. Doesn't have to be explicitly sexual either. It can just kind of be like cuteness, but it's this kind of like warm, fuzzy, like crushing feeling that you get for a character that's cute or whatever. And so you can see they really leaned into it with some of this stuff for sure. These are, I think, all three of the ones in the middle and the right are depictions of the same character. Again, having not played the game, I can't say all this for sure, but I believe these are like collectible versions, like maybe cards or something which you can upgrade, and there's different versions along the way, different color schemes and stuff that you can collect. Exactly what the religious content of this is, I don't know. I don't know how, you know, well they link that to any actual like religious concept, to any like, you know, Buddhist dogma or scripture or anything. So I don't know. Hopefully someday I'll get to check that out soon. But as we go, you start to see more of this stuff. I don't know specifically because I'm only sort of able to really look at scholarship that's already been done and just kind of stuff that I found on the internet. I've looked through a whole bunch of websites. A lot of this I actually found on like some Chinese sites that I couldn't read. And but there's definitely evidence of interest in this in other like East Asian countries. But mostly I'm just kind of compiling stuff from a host of sources that I don't fully understand, or haven't had, you know, excessive time to sift through to do like a really deep dive on this. So I don't know exactly how much of this Ryohoji is responsible for, versus how much of it sort of, you know, came up around the same time of its own accord, or, you know, just due to people having the same ideas at the same time or whatever. But as you can see here, we also have not just the figures themselves, but these things, for those who don't know, we have goshuin, which are like temple stamps. They're kind of these commemorative, not collectible, that's the wrong word. Traditionally, it's more for like, you made a pilgrimage to a temple. in some capacity, and you go up to a window and a monk will like sign these for you. They'll put a big stamp on it and then usually in nice calligraphy sign sort of the name of the temple and like the date that you visited and stuff like that. And you can sort of see what examples of this kind of look like. But of course, usually they don't feature adorable anime characters. So that's a little bit different. The pictures on the top are gosuincho, which are like these sort of temple stamp books that people will sometimes buy. And just here you can see these sort of like cute, manga anime style covers on these. The one in the sort of center upper quadrant there is from Karakai Jozu no Takaki-san, which is an ongoing manga and anime. And so it's kind of come full circle. That's not a religious thing at all. It's just a show and comic that exist. And they have, made this book to go to temples with that features this character. And you can see somebody has actually used a stamp of the character on one of these goshuincho. And those are just like from the Amazon page where you can buy this. So these things are around, but you can also see some sort of very provocative images here of a couple of Buddhist deities from another temple that has sort of instituted this. And honestly, I can't remember the name of the temple. It probably says on one of these, but my kanji reading is not the best. And I'm unsure of who's supposed to be who here. I'm a little unclear as to who exactly these are supposed to be. You can see the name of the temple, I think, in on the lower left of each of these, but I can't read it without some assistance. And I'm not going to sit here and type these into my dictionary or whatever and try to come up with the right onyomi. So it is what it is. But yeah, I think kannon is written on the right hand picture, but either way, not entirely sure. These might both be associated with kannon in some capacity. I'm not sure, because I guess that says that in the middle also. But I'm very unfortunately, yeah, I think that's saint, not actually saint, but the first character there, and then kannon after that. And I don't know what the final two characters are in the very center there. But anyway, regardless, I don't know enough about any of this stuff to give you any sort of detail on this, unfortunately, because my studies of actual Japanese Buddhism are like very few and far between. But moving on, we can see more stuff here, which sort of it goes in it, and even it's even more. It's just piling on at this point, and we're sort of almost looking at like Buddhism as a fandom now. You can see more very provocative images, mostly of women. This is generally a very sort of female-centered beautifying and sexualizing of characters, though there are definitely male figures as well. Like they are out there, just far less frequent, and tend to be a bit less sexualized, as opposed to just like sort of looking very like strong and powerful and intimidating and stuff, as you might imagine. Regardless, my time looking at this stuff, I found all kinds of things from weird places, and it was hard to track down in some capacities, and also easy in others. But there's not like a huge repository of these things in many places. But I did find this a couple of places that both appeared to be Chinese that really focused on this stuff, and one guy who appeared to have basically like a big blog about it. And I really wished that he was in Taiwan. I really wished that I could read Chinese, because I was really curious what he was actually saying about this stuff, because he had these big blog posts with these huge, collections of images from all over the place. But regardless, my point being, this is sort of extended a little bit beyond just Japan, and you see stuff from China, Taiwan, South Korea, at least expressing interest in this stuff, if not making it directly themselves. It's kind of out there in the, fandom zeitgeist, I guess, or maybe even just the modern Buddhist zeitgeist. But these sexy versions of Buddhist characters that you just see coming from a bunch of different quarters. Certainly you see them in like games. That's a pretty common place for these things to have happened, and that's happened over time, for quite some time. Me and my friend Dustin, who I spoke of earlier, they came to visit me while I was in Japan. Both of us are fans of Shin Megami Tensei game series. Many people know it for Persona these days. And that has featured a lot of like, weird little sort of cameos by, various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, which is kind of fun, in addition to, things from folklore and whatever. And so in sort of that context, I think we have seen that kind of stuff over the years, and I'd really like to learn more about this. I'd really like to learn a lot more about this. And someday, hopefully, I'll find the time. But yeah, that stuff definitely exists, and I know has informed on this concept a bit. And you definitely see both professionals and hobbyist illustrators who kind of produce this stuff for varying reasons. And it's just kind of fascinating. I mean, if those of you who can read Japanese there, you can see that we have a couple of bodhisattvas. In the middle, you have Fugen Bosatsu. And I believe actually it's in the middle of the screen, but kind of the lower left of that rightmost block. I believe that's actually supposed to be Jizo, sort of a feminized version. It often carries that staff. And a lot of these do kind of have like the animal and ornamental like things that would normally accompany them. Often staves or swords, spears. You can see Fugen Bosatsu, whose name outside of Japanese I cannot remember at the moment, so forgive me for that. But you often see with this Buddhist ritual implement behind her, and like some sort of elephant animal, which can be more or less fantastic. In this case, it's this cute little chibi thing, and a dead giveaway for many of these things as well is the like lotus or flower platforms that they stand on, which is often a dead giveaway that this is in some way linked to Buddhism. A little more explicit on this page, you can see some actual nudity. I didn't include a lot of that, though it certainly exists. I thought this one was particularly funny because, like, I don't know if that's supposed to be her. I'm honestly not sure which figure this is supposed to be, but you can see like and this may be like a Hindu holdover. Some of this stuff has spilled out into like other realms, and of course many Buddhist figures come from other traditions originally, regardless. But I love the fact that she has a bunch of naked versions of her, equally naked, on top of her head, which I find amusing as well. But certainly there is some much more explicit stuff, some kind of like not even borderline, some outright pornographic stuff, some borderline pornographic stuff, and then some kind of just stuff like this, which isn't strictly pornographic so much as it's just kind of revealing, or sexualized in some way, or just very much wanting to use human form for one reason or another. Not all of it necessarily is what you see here, like giant breasts and very slim bodies. It can vary wildly. So, it's not all the same. And these are only a handful of images from the many that I was able to track down. But yeah, just some kind of interesting stuff. This group that did the image in the middle of Mahavarokana, that it was a group. I just looked up Buddha Studio because I saw that little logo in the corner, and lo and behold, I found BuddhaBlade.com, which is apparently a collection of illustrators that is doing some of this like Buddhist themed, manga style pop art. I didn't spend a whole lot of time on the website because it takes me a while to parse these things, even though I can read some Japanese. Like it takes me a good while to sit there and parse out stuff, especially when you're talking religion, because I don't know all of the religious terminology that ends up getting used in a lot of this stuff in Japanese, like at all. So that slows me way down. But yeah, in this case, I was having trouble even figuring out exactly who they were and exactly what they wanted to do. On one hand, it kind of seemed like they talked about like Buddhism being like the oldest fantasy, and I'm like, well, do you mean that as you consider it to be fantasy and not real? Is this not something that you're actually like wanting to be part of in a serious way, and you're just drawing on for inspiration. But this image kind of made me think a little differently, because this feels a little more serious. Like the central text there. Maybe I'm translating this right. You may well think different, but as far as I can tell, like kaero, like let's come back, or a suggestion of coming back. Hahanaru nyorai, nyorai being a term for the tathagata, returning one. So hahanaru nyorai no Matsuri e, like go back to the house where the tathagata that will become your mother waits, or something like that. It's an interesting connotation. It's an interesting feeling, this kind of motherly feeling that they've put in here, even though this is a very clearly highly sexualized character, barely wearing anything, but also, despite the large breasts and like wider hips and whatever, and the very revealing clothing, has a kind of calm, the expression does not indicate sexuality in any particular way, as some of these things often do. So it's kind of an interesting contrast. I don't know exactly what to make of that, or this particular group, but maybe at some point I'll have time to go back and look at that a little more. But so in conclusion, we had talked about the fact that Japan has actually quite a long history of irreverent comic depictions of Buddhist iconography, at least since the Edo period. There certainly may well be stuff from before that I'm not overly familiar with. It has had both positive and negative portrayals throughout its history, as far back as Edo, but also, of course, in film and manga and anime, which were definitely complicated by the Shinrikyo debacle after the sarin gas attacks. But over time, more sympathetic views sort of came back to the fore, and stories about cults that had been prevalent as just pure vitriol got at least more nuanced, and depictions of traditional religion managed to get a bit softer, warmer, friendlier, such as with the case of Saint Young Men, which I showed you. Ryohoji, the temple we looked at, is certainly the most well-known case, but there are also a number of other temples and such that are doing similar things, sort of flirting with this idea of adding either cuteness or sex appeal, or both, to their kind of recruitive tool set. And a lot of illustrators have really run with this idea as well, so you can fairly easily go out there. I don't know about in English, but at least on the Asian web, you can get out there and find these kind of like beautified, sexualized portrayals of Buddhist icons. Most of the time they are going to be female, but not always. There are also definitely people who are working with the male form, at least periodically, as well. And from what I was able to find, I did a fair dive on this as far as like trying to find, good sources to use. But, let's face it, this is just undergraduate work. I'm not getting any like special, time or attention when it comes to this stuff. And I know there are people who are studying religion in video games, although for the most part, that seems to almost exclusively be in the Western context. I found tons of stuff on Christianity in games and that sort of thing, and very little on Eastern religions generally, and Buddhism specifically. And that's actually an area of scholarship that I kind of hope I might be able to find some time to get into myself. It's something that interests me, and I have a couple of contacts at the university who are going to maybe potentially get me in touch with some people who can tell me a little more about that, and maybe I can find that there's actually some scholarship that I've just totally missed, which is certainly possible because I only have so much time and I'm writing a billion research papers this semester. So, but from what I was able to find, more scholarship is definitely needed in these two areas particularly, which is the ways that Buddhism has been portrayed in Japanese music and in video games. I think there's a lot of room for more scholarship in both of those cases. I was able to find very little, which is why they're not really featured here. And these here are in the order that I discussed them. kind of some of the sources that I originally drew from when I was writing this paper. These in themselves are all worthwhile articles to take a look at if you have access to them. I found them all pretty interesting for the most part, but far and away the most interesting, at least to sort of the modern context that I was most interested in, was Julienned Kannon. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. His two works here. He is, I believe, officially now an actual PhD holder. At the time that he published his book, he was simply pursuing his doctorate. But he was at the University of Hawaii, which is a very well-known hub of Asian studies. And he also published a book, which I'm holding in my hands and can't show you because for some reason OBS doesn't like my webcam anymore, and I haven't figured out how to fix that since the last time it broke. But regardless, he has a book called Drawing on Tradition, Manga, Anime, and Religion in Contemporary Japan. And that is also a very interesting look that goes into more detail about a lot of this stuff. So definitely give that a look if that's a thing you're interested in. You can buy it on Amazon for $15 or whatever, and definitely seems like it's worth the money. So that about does it for me, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed and got something out of that, and hopefully I will see you at some point later. Take care.